Hey everyone, and welcome to my Procreate demo for the piece I call The Occultist. So this is the, I believe, sixth and final, for now, character from the Village Corrupted series of characters that I have recently been doing. I'm going to just put it on hold for now because I'm going to move to other things, but I do feel pretty passionately about this overall thing, so I'll come back to it at some point. But for now, this is the last one. This guy is called the Occultist. I had this idea pretty early on, but just sort of wanted to get through some of the other types of characters before I got to him. You can see here in the rough sketch, you can see how straightforward the rough sketch is, that I sort of had this idea pretty clear in my head. So he is a mage who uses like blood and pain to wield very powerful spells. That's sort of his whole shtick. So he's got these panels that are part of his gauntlets that flip up and they sort of smack into his hand and stab his hand to create blood and pain so that he can then do spells and all that kind of stuff. So I've actually always loved the idea of like a blood mage type character. For as long as I can remember. I drew a blood mage like 12 years ago, I think. It's on my DeviantArt account, and that was more of like an Asian spin on the blood mage, and he had these pins that he was sticking into himself. So this is just taking that sort of like more European Gothic angle on the whole thing. And so I wanted this character to be really dark, but he's also very sort of stoic. It's like when his whole life is about pain, sort of nothing really matters anymore. So that's why he is very still, and he is very almost monolithic, and then he has this spell that he's casting all around his hand. So anyways, into the actual process here of what I've done. It's the thing I usually do. We've got fat pencil linked below. That's how I'm doing all this rough, and then I'm just sort of doing the super rough right now. You can see me roughing in the hand and then getting a little bit more clear about what that hand's actually doing. I like the idea of showing it, you know, post stabbing, I guess you could say, and now he's wielding this spell that's going to be something. The thing is, amongst all of the characters that I've done so far, this guy is actually the most powerful out of all of them. But I think it's pretty understandable that he also has the lowest amount of stamina, in the sense that he can only do so much to himself before he has to have downtime, basically. So that's the gist behind the character. And you can see here we're moving into the face details. I also wanted this guy to just have this real, I mean, it's almost funny, but in the context it ends up just making him look like he's got just this really distinctive face. But this big-ass nose, I thought that was going to be key to his silhouette. He's got this almost column-like body, and then he's got these spikes sticking off with this little head sort of in amongst all of his like bondage, almost like chastity mantle type thing that he's got on, and then this nose sort of sticking out there. It sort of balances what otherwise would look like a dude that's like completely trapped in his own armor, and it gives him a little bit of this forward quality by giving him this big nose. So I think that I sort of got across what I was looking for in this guy, which is he's fairly smart and he's fairly calm and rational, but all of his powers derive from a sort of irrational place, which is like to do harm to oneself in order to then do the thing. So yeah, he would be sort of an interesting character. I guess if you're familiar with things like Exo Squad, he would almost temperamentally be like the Marsala of the group, you could say. I know it's kind of a weird thing to pull out, but that's sort of how I think. I always gravitate towards the Marsala type characters, whether it's Marsala himself or like a Martian Manhunter, or like just that really stoic character that everybody can rely on but is probably troubled in some way. That's sort of what I like about where this guy kind of went. I'm not really talking about the process too much. I'm talking more about the ideation, because this was very straightforward. As you can imagine, once you're on to the sixth one in a series where you're using similar techniques, there's not a whole lot that you're doing that's brand new or experimental. In fact, the experiment aspect of this comes out a lot more in how do I keep this exactly the same while also exploring where it can go that makes it a little bit different. If you've seen my Pink Hair Girl book that I put out a couple years ago, that was a very extreme study in this. In fact, when I started that book, you can Google it and find it, and I've even done a Pink Hair Girl as part of my YouTube video, so you can find that. But when I originally did that Pink Hair Girl series, it was based off one image, which then became 3 images, and then after 3, it was like, well, why stop there? I'm going to do more. And I had really tight restrictions around what one of those pieces could look like. And then over time, I started expanding it and realizing sort of more where I could take the very limited framework, but then push it in certain ways and get something interesting and maybe drop aspects of the framework because it actually wasn't that interesting. It was more interesting to ignore it. And I think that that's sort of where I've gotten to with this series so far. It's about keeping the things that are indicative of the look and feel the same, but then trying to explore it a bit. I think that in some ways, maybe not so much maybe it's not as extreme as I sort of think of it in my head, but I just sort of feel like the Occultist is quite different from others in the series. But I think that I could only get to him and sort of how glowy his magic ends up being in this piece. I could only get to that if I went through some of the other ones. So if you look at the process, the Battler is very sort of like earthy. There's not a lot of glitz and glamour to that piece. And then the next one is the Corpse Mage, and I think I ended up changing the name. I don't think he's called Corpse Mage anymore. Wow, I've even forgotten my own guys. Anyways, he is also pretty muted. You know, he's a mage of some sort, but since he's dealing with like dead flesh, it's very basic in its presentation. It's just not very glamorous. Then you start getting over into like the Graven Templar, and the ghost is very glowy, and you get into the Hunter, and she's got that like bright eye on her shoulder and stuff. So like really it was about sort of incrementally getting over. Oh, and then of course the Flayer. The Flayer is sort of a nice bridge between the Graven Templar and the Corpse Mage, because he has a couple of more interesting colors about him, and he's got a couple a little bit more like glints and shines because of his weapons and the blood, and he's got that second character now sort of in the scene. And so these small steps end up sort of opening up what this series could be. So I wanted to take time to explain that and sort of explain some of the mentality behind that, because so much of what's going on in this piece is very by the numbers. So I knew a lot about where I wanted this character to go before I even put pencil to paper. I knew that I wanted him to have this dull sort of iron as part of his costume, and these spikes. I actually sort of originally wanted to go really crazy with the spikes, but I also didn't want him to be about the spikes. You know, I didn't want it to be only this guy that's covered in spikes. I think that that is a cool thing, and I think that that should be saved maybe for somebody who's less of a main character, and maybe somebody who's more of just like something that these guys would fight maybe, because then you could go really nuts with that. You don't have to worry about sort of finding the humanity in that character. And so, but I knew that I wanted this iron, I wanted these spikes, and then the actual clothes that he's in, I wanted the rest of that to be soft, but I kind of thought it'd be cool if like his arm was like leather, like patent leather. But then in the middle of doing it, like I didn't really know if I wanted patent leather or pleather or anything like that to really be a part of this world. So I ended up just saying, okay, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep everything very dark. This whole series has been very dark in terms of value, not even just tone, but value. But I want to draw all the attention up to his face and to his hand that's casting the spell. I knew that I wanted him to be really pale from the get-go. So I was like, okay, cool. Well, what we'll do is we'll just take everything from the neck down and we'll make it really dark, and then we'll take his skin and make it really pale, and his hair and make it really bright and pale. And that'll draw all of this attention up to his face and the spell. And then I'm not going to worry about making that leather shiny or doing anything like that, because it's not important, and it might not even be important to have it in this world right now. Now, as far as tricks go, I duplicated those two little loops that are connecting the pieces of cloth, and then I just tweaked them a little bit so that they looked at least a little bit different. And then here on the big lock in the center, what I did was I took the circle brush in the airbrush section and placed a dot, and then I duplicated that dot, shrunk it a little bit, and then I erased away that smaller dot from the bigger dot. And what it did was it gives you like a very perfect circle. But because this is all pencil drawn, in order to make that pencil look a little bit, or to make that circle look a little bit damaged, I then select that new circle that I've created, and I go in and I just quickly fill it with pencil so that it looks a little bit more like it was drawn with pencil. In lieu of a true ellipses tool or a circle tool or anything like that, this is the best way that I found in order to do that. It all goes by a little bit quick, but if you go back through it, you can see it, I think, pretty clearly how it's done. It's fairly straightforward, but if people really want to see something like that, go ahead and post, and I'll do a more detailed breakdown on how I do that in a future video, because I'm always doing circles, so might as well. So now we move from the lock to the right hand, his right hand. I love drawing hands. I've said that before. Even if I end up messing up the anatomy in some way, I just love hands. Hands and faces are my two favorite things to draw, which is why I find any opportunity I can to just do a headshot with a hand in there or something, similar to the Alberto piece that I did not that long ago. But yeah, I just think it's really fun. So with this guy, I was sort of most excited about getting to this hand. And then there's even some tweaks that I end up doing when I'm in the middle of it, because I really want to make sure that this part sings, because it's going to be the focal point ultimately of the piece. His face is there, but you know, if he's casting spells with blood and he's casting a big blood spell in the page, that's what people are going to be looking at the most. Now, one thing to point out in the hand here is I actually draw the blood in, and after I did it, I just sort of did it because I was mindlessly drawing away, and then I was like, nah, shit, I'm totally going to do that in paints. I'm not going to do that in blood. Or, I mean, I'm not going to do that in lines. So I end up putting it in more as reference is what I use it for. And then when I get to the coloring phase, that's where I get the blood into the hand. It's very similar to the way that I've done the blood in any of the past ones that have blood. So the Flayer and the Battler, I think that's it for blood. Yeah, that's it for blood, I think. And so it's basically just, it's sort of like the most painterly aspect of these, because they get lots of just raw flats. And then this is where I do a little bit of splattery blood type painting type stuff. So now we're going to get into the patterning on these cloth parts that are coming down. For this, I didn't have any iconography in mind, but once I started drawing it, I just basically rotated things and went with 90 degrees and tried to create something that looked like a pattern that would fit potentially him, some sort of symbol that looks like it could be about him. You can see over here on the gauntlet now, I'm using the exact same technique that I used on the lock, and then I'm using the circle that I've created and I'm warping it so that I can get the perspective that I want. In order to make everything have the hand-drawn feel, though, and not feel too clinical, I'm then going over it and drawing over that again and just using those circles as guides. That way I can still put in like little quirks here and there, like sort of, I guess, deliberate mistakes, but it's really more just about it not being perfect so that it feels like it marries with the rest of the illustration. Here you can see me employing the line tool in Procreate quite a bit in order to get some of this all lined up. This was a mechanism that I hadn't totally figured out, so I sort of bullshitted aspects of the mechanism, but you can see what I'm doing here, since I'm working with lots of different layers, is I'm going in and drawing the gauntlet as a whole piece, and then inserting the panel as a whole piece, and then I start figuring out how the actual rotation mechanism works. Right there with the spike, obviously works smarter, not harder. I just did one spike and then I duplicated it a bunch and then erased away so that I got the right layering that I was looking for. In fact, what I did was I duplicated it, I think, 4 times to get the first 5, and then I just duplicated those 5 groups so that it looked like it was manufactured in a somewhat logical way. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking, and on another layer, I'm starting to cut out the sections where it would flip up, then going in and adding something that looks like a hinge, hiding a bunch of what that mechanism might ultimately be, because it's not necessary for the actual piece. It's somewhere in there. If I were like Masamune Shiro or something, I'd put like a note about all the complexity about how it works, but we're not there yet. Here you can see I started lining up the shoulders and realizing that there were, or excuse me, the elbows, and realizing that I had a bit of a bend issue. So I moved his arm up and adjusted some of the anatomy there. Now I'm putting in those spikes on the bottom of his right arm gauntlet. And then at some point soon, I end up taking the entire illustration and shrinking him down just a bit to get him a little, framed just a little bit better. Similar to what I did with the Hunter, how she was a little bit too big. That's all. Obviously, the nice thing about digital is that you can do those types of things, but it's also one of the negative aspects of Procreate is I had to shrink it down instead of expanding the canvas because it's just easier to do it that way. Ultimately, I could have also just duplicated all of this into a new file with a bigger canvas if I wanted to, but I was just going more for speed. So now that we've got the lines done, as in other pieces, I converted the lines to a light brown and then made them a multiply layer. You can see here I say whoops because I actually outlined the interior part, and this is my master flat, so I didn't have to do that. I almost did it again right there, you can see. So this is me just going in and putting in the master flat that I end up using for lots of things, whether it's isolating the entire silhouette or whether it's just making it easier to apply the future flats. But yeah, so you can see I also have a palette here where I've got like a green background going on because I thought that that was the way I wanted to take it. I thought that if he was going to have blood, I would go with a complementary green background. But as the illustration goes on, I decided that something actually a little more monochromatic was actually the way to go. I have his super pale red hair in, I have his really pale skin, and then I'm starting to get the black of his outfit. Now he's still fairly even across. I mean, that's certainly darker at the bottom, but you can see right there where I really start going for it. I start making that much darker and start increasing this contrast, and then as the illustration goes on, I even go in and put just darkening to try and vignette his body all around the outer side. I didn't know how I was going to represent the blood spell at this point. I thought that it might not be quite as luminescent as it ends up being, so I didn't know if I was going to make that a light source of any kind, but as the illustration goes on and I'm just sort of trying to find where it goes, that's what I end up doing. Here's where I'm regretting doing such a complicated pattern because the flats for it were really annoying to do. And then you can see there I did just a bunch of little value tweaks on that. Here we're getting some of the blood that's under the hand, under the skin, before we start doing the blood that's on top of the skin. I wanted him to be a little bit gaunt, so we got some dark shadowing in his cheeks. I made his lips a little purpley dark because I just thought that that would be cool, and then I sort of end up removing some of it. You can see right there. Put a few gradients to separate his head from his collar. And now here we're doing the blood part. This was really fun. So I went in with a bright red, and then I set that to multiply to get this really dark aspect to the blood. But then I went back in with the bright blood that wasn't set to multiply, just to put like a little bit fresher blood around it, just to give it like a little bit more depth by having some parts of it that were sort of a brighter red and some of it that were a darker red. And then I've got the droplets as just like a true red, because they aren't really on top of anything to alter its raw color, I guess you could say. Here I am putting shine on where the wet blood is on the metal, putting a little shine in the cuts. There's little twinkles in the cuts so that you can really see that that's like wet and damaged in there. Now here's where I finally decided, okay, let's figure out how we're going to do the blood spell. So I've got some blue lines and some red lines. Some of these lines are to take place behind the hand, and others are for in front of the hand. I decided that I'm going to go with a similar look and feel to what I did with the Ghost, where the lines were going to be bright red. The fill was going to be the same color, but then with like a lowered opacity, and then I was going to erase away some aspects of that flat in order to give it a little more transparency in spots. But then I said, well, it could also be really cool to make this really like it's got volume, like it's not just energy. It might actually be chunks of plasma. So I put these little shines all on it to give it a little bit more depth. At this stage, I just did a bunch of lighting right there, just adding some glow to the blood, and then some gradients of red sort of trailing off onto the actual character. And now here I'm just going all for it and putting a rim light on the some of the closest aspects, because I wanted the glow from I wanted the stuff that was being affected by the blood in terms of light to be very focused. I didn't want it to be something that was like illuminating the whole illustration. It was very tight. So I just took a red, started painting it where the light would be, lowered the opacity on it. I actually tweaked the opacity here and there as I'm going, but ultimately it's just a lowered opacity set to red. Now here I start on the background, same method as I showed in the last video. Well, sorry, not the last video, 2 videos ago, but it's the last Village Corrupted video. And here I wanted him to look like he was almost in like the Occultist Citadel or something where he's in this just really weird, dark, almost underground looking place that has these spires and these bridges and stuff. So that's what I was trying to sort of get at with this. And so it's all done the same way where it's silhouettes that are painted, and then I go to like another layer, paint another silhouette and lower its opacity, and then another one still. So right now we've got sort of like this foreground bridge arch type thing. Then we've got this midground arch, and then we're going to put some big towers in the background, and those are the ones that are furthest back. And they're all going to have little spikes here and there to try and echo some of what's going on with the Occultist. And this is more or less going to start wrapping things up. This guy was fun. This whole series has been really fun. I hope to get back to it sometime soon. But for now, this is the last guy in the series. So I hope you dig it, and I hope you've dug the run so far. Here's just a close-up look of all of what's going on there. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places you can find me.